Good morning. You're listening to Mr. Bryce Mugwe, and I'm going to be telling you about photosynthesis. But before we go right deep into it, I want us to look at the word itself, photosynthesis. Look at this word, we could divide it into two parts, a prefix that says photo and a suffix that says synthesis. Okay. So then, photo would mean light, and synthesis means to make, to manufacture, to produce. So in actual fact, we are synthesizing something, and that something at a later stage we're going to find out that it is actually organic molecules, for example polysaccharide starch, starting from simpler molecules like glucose. So we are synthesizing glucose, for example, using using light. Hence, that's why we define photosynthesis as the process by which plants use light, sunlight energy, to synthesize, to manufacture their own food. And that food we're referring to is glucose, for example. Now, before we go deep into it, I would like us to look at the history of photosynthesis, how it all came to be. We did not wake up one day and start understanding this whole process, no. Somehow some people did some research, and back then in the 1600s, the ancient Greeks believed that plants were using soil in order to grow their own body parts. They believed that plants were feeding from soil to grow their parts. Hence, they refer to plants as soil eaters. It means organisms that physically or basically eat soil in order to grow their own parts. That's what the ancient Greeks believed. Now, to investigate that hypothesis of soil eating, a scientist set up an experiment where he took a tree and planted it inside a pot with soil in it and left it to grow while pouring some amount of water every now and then as required by the plant. After the end of his investigation, the tree had increased in mass by 74 kgs, while the soil that the tree was growing on was or lost only about 700 grams. Now, when we compare 700 grams and 74 kg, the difference is too wide. Hence, it was easy to then prove that the hypothesis of saying that plants eat soil while they're growing was not accepted. So then, the other question was, what could then account for the mass, that's 74 kg? What could then account for the mass of the plant, if not of the soil? Because at this point, we could realize that plants don't eat soil. What then could account for that extra mass, 74 kg? That's when other people took the investigations a bit further. And another scientist came up with an investigation where he took a bell jar and covered it, lit a match, put under, and the match burned and the fire died out. Now, he then took a twig, a branch with leaves, and put under the bell jar, lit the match again, and this time the fire was always burning without extinguishing itself. He then told that there is something in the air that the fire needs in order to stay alive or alight. And that something in the air was missing at one point. That's why the fire got extinguished. And when he introduced the twig with leaves on it, that something that was missing that made the fire to die out was replaced. And that something came from plants. Today we know that that something is oxygen, because obviously a flame will die out if there's no oxygen. If you cover a certain place, the flame will burn, yes. At some point, after using up all the oxygen available in the air, that flame will eventually die out. Now, from his experiment, he could then prove that somehow the plant was producing that oxygen so that the fire could always stay alight without dying out. But his experiment was not very famous because he could not easily replicate it. Each time he repeated it, the outcome was not exactly the same. Not until another scientist took interest in his experiment nonetheless and went further to add something to that experiment. That scientist did the same thing, put a bell, covered it, put fire there, extinguished, put a plant twig, the fire came back, or lit the fire stayed alight without extinguishing itself because the plant was producing oxygen. But this time he included another factor, and that factor was light. I'm sure we see where we are driving to. We are going to photo light. Now, that scientist then put the bell jar, covered it, put a twig of plant under the bell jar, put fire, and allowed sunlight to reach the plant through the transparent bell jar. Now, the fire kept on going. And when he removed light and with the plant twig under the bell jar, the fire went on, but just for a short while it went off. To prove that whatever was in the air was being replaced by something coming from the plant, he then took out the plant and left light through the bell jar. It means we now have light, we have bell jar, we have fire, but the fire went off. And when he combined all of them, now light, fire, bell jar, plant, the fire always stayed on. It means that somehow he came to discover that whatever the plant is producing, that replaces the oxygen in the air. For the plant to produce that, it needs light. So that's why we're saying that light is required for photosynthesis to occur, and one of the byproducts is then oxygen. It means that oxygen is something that is made aside the organic molecules as glucose. We call it a byproduct because oxygen is just made by the way. The process is to make organic molecules, but while making glucose, by the way, oxygen is made. Along the way, by the way, byproduct, oxygen is made. From there now, other scientists then were able to prove that plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. Now, if we look at the whole equation, we can summarize the equation of photosynthesis. We can summarize it as 6 molecules of carbon dioxide will combine with 6 molecules of water with E. E represents energy to produce glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. Otherwise, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, that's 6 CO2, plus 6 molecules of water, that's 6 H2O, plus E, which is energy from the sun, will produce C6 H12O6, that is glucose, plus 6 O2, that is 6 molecules of oxygen. That is the equation from where we'll be working. Now, before then we go into the actual process, we would want to investigate what happens, how the plant is able to drive this process. Photosynthesis occurs mainly in the leaves of plants. I say mainly to say that it doesn't only occur in the leaves of plants per se, because photosynthesis will occur on most plant parts that look green. That could also include the stem and could also include parts of the flower for plants that produce flowers, flowering plants like the angiosperms. If you look at the flower, we'll see that the flower has an outer wall that we called back then the calyx. The calyx looks green, hence it can also photosynthesize. So any part that looks green on the plant should be able to photosynthesize. Now, I've been saying green. What gives this green color to these plants, to these plant parts? This green color is caused by the presence of a pigment. Pigment are substances that could have color Our clothes are pigmented, that's why our clothes have colors. And anything that has color is then able to absorb light. It means it has a property of trapping light and absorbing it, so that it can use the aspect of light, which is energy, to drive reactions, such as this one of photosynthesis. Now, that color, that pigment that looks green in plants is what we call chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is present in a certain structure which is present in plant cells that we call chloroplast. Now we'll then look at the structural adaptation of the leaf before we go to the chloroplast. We'll look at the structural adaptation of the leaf. We have a leaf here. We can look at the external structure of that leaf to see how it is suited for photosynthesis. Now, the leaf itself, when we look at the leaf, we can see that it is green, meaning it has a lot of pigments that are able to trap the light. The leaf itself represents an organ. Okay, looks green. That pigment is able to trap light. If we look at the leaf again, secondly, we'll see that it has a broad surface, relatively broad surface. It means that it has a large surface area so that it can present enough space to trap sunlight. If the leaf was just thin, then it cannot trap enough sunlight, enough energy for photosynthesis. So the more broad it is, the more sunlight it can trap, the more energy it can trap. Consequently, the faster or the more it can drive this process of photosynthesis. The leaf also has, mostly at the lower surface, openings through which gases can either go in or out, or water can also go in or out, moisture from the air. These openings are called stomata. They are mostly found at the base of the leaf there. Okay, so gases can easily go into the stomata. Now, the leaf, again, if we see on the surface here, if we see on the surface of the leaf, we'll see structures that look like veins, traditionally, that look like veins on the surface here. These structures are vascular tissues, such as the xylem and the phloem. Now, in that equation of photosynthesis that we looked at earlier, we said water was one of the requirements of photosynthesis, one of the reactants. So water will come from the roots, that's why roots absorb water, and be transported throughout the plant until they reach every leaf, passing through tubes, tiny tubes that we call xylem, which transports water so that it can supply water as a component, a reactant for that process of photosynthesis. And when photosynthesis occurs, remember, it makes food. That's why we say the process by which plants make their own food using energy. It means plants will make food. That food will be passing also through another kind of vessel that we call phloem. So we have two vessels here, one for transporting water, one for transporting food. Phloem. That food will be transported and stored in the form of starch, which is the storage form of polysaccharides in plants. Now, make no mistake, although animals eat plants, originally the plant is making food for itself. Because just like you and I need foods to provide our bodies with energy so that we can do our daily activities and stay alive, plants also make their own food for themselves so that they can also provide themselves with energy, which is gotten as a result of respiration, which is the oxidation of food. In our case, since we are aerobic organisms, oxidation of food occurs in us through the use of oxygen as a final electron acceptor. We'll see that when we're looking at cellular respiration in another chapter. Now, plants also respire because they first manufactured food. They are able to manufacture food. Hence, they are called autotrophs. Automatic. They can make food for themselves, by themselves, automatically. Added to plants making food for themselves, by themselves, we also have some microorganisms like photosynthetic bacteria and chemosynthetic bacteria, which also, photosynthetic bacteria also uses sunlight to manufacture its own food, just the way plants do. And chemosynthetic bacteria don't use sunlight, no, but they actually use chemical reactions to make their own food. These chemical reactions provide them with energy the same way as light provides energy for plants to make food. The chemical reactions provide energy for these bacteria to make their own food. Hence, they are all autotrophs. And since they produce food, this food can then be used by organisms upper in the food chain. Hence, the plants and these bacteria are classified as producers because they're the ones who make food. And consumers will now feed from these plants. Since these consumers don't make their own food by themselves automatically, we call them heterotrophs. That includes the herbivores, the carnivores, the omnivores, even the decomposers are referred to as heterotrophs. Hetero means different. They feed on things that are made by different organisms, different things. Okay, so that's basically how, or the purpose of photosynthesis. Now, we will then want to investigate inside and see what part precisely drives this process. And that part is an organelle called the chloroplast.